when I think of the World Bank and the IMF, I think of reading those reports on economic conditions that often have table upon table of statistics and information. And when I was an economist at the central bank, you would judge the economic policies relative to that data, and you would assess the effectiveness relative to another set of data. How do you deal when you don't have the surveys or when you don't have the statistics, or must you start with gathering data?
Well, believe it or not, and I'm sure you know, World Bank and IMF staff often also start out in countries with very limited data. In the context of Iraq, for example, we got there, and while in developing countries or transitioning economies, there was a paucity of data that one always had to deal with. In Iraq, there was paucity of data as well because of the security environment and the lack of infrastructure and power and water and computers and ability to travel and telephones and the like. So you establish your trusted advisor relationship with your local counterparts, and you work together with them within the framework of you knowing where it is you need to get to, but you build blocks one at a time very often. In the case of Iraq, we were very fortunate. We, at least at Rafidain Bank, 3 of the senior managers, expecting the invasion, had taken home 14 zip disks of the financial information of the bank as of, I think it was February, the end of February 2003. So that by the time we got there, or I got there in May, it was already several months behind. There was a basic set of data that I could use as a starting point. The challenge was the software was outdated software. The language was Arabic. The accounting standards were questionable and of poor quality at the time. And so there was a lot of interpretation that needed to go into looking at the numbers. Iraq had been a closed economy for many years as well. And so the banking system had not benefited from the advances in accounting and auditing, for example. Prudential regulations, BIS 1 had not yet entered the Central Bank of Iraq. And so while BIS 2 was coming out. So there was a lot of sort of, there was a great need for experience in interpretation and challenges in gathering the numbers and the data in that environment.
You mentioned having blocks.
Building blocks.
Building blocks. Is there a certain order that you must use for those building blocks to actually create the kind of foundation that you need to have sustainable growth?
There are, you mean in terms of timing and sequencing of reforms as opposed to the data issues. In terms of timing and sequencing of reforms, I think before we look at specific policies, security must exist. Without security, it's very difficult to see economic growth prospects in a positive light, and therefore within the banking system as well, the risk aversion of bankers, irrespective of whether they were state bankers or private commercial bankers, risk aversion is rational behavior in an unstable environment. And so as economists, we accept that. And we know that the security situation first needs to be in place. That said, preparatory work needs to take place during the insecure times, as well as the period when the security is improving. And for example, when we were concerned about liquidity in the banking system of Iraq, and there was no infrastructure and there was no security, and the only way I could get daily balances was to hand satellite phones to regional managers and have them call me daily with cash balances from each of the branches all over the country. This was an impossible type of environment almost to work in, but it worked. Mm-hmm. And so we were able, at least daily, to have some idea of what the liquidity situation was and to protect the banks from a run on the banks in that environment. So the infrastructure is important. The central bank and the stability of the macroeconomic environment was important. We needed to make sure the currency was protected, and a new currency, in fact, was issued in the case of Iraq. In other countries, that has not happened. For example, in Lebanon, after the 17-year civil war, of course, the currency remained the same, but they suffered very, very high rates of inflation and debt obligations following the war. So each country is different, and so the building blocks would be different. The Central Bank of Iraq's independence and authority over monetary policy and banking supervision needed to be updated, as is the case in all post-conflict environments that I've studied and in which I've worked, but also the banks themselves in these countries, whether transitioning from a centralized economic management or post-conflict. The banks themselves need to be set on a path of sustainable institutional development and institution building such that they can compete and they can provide the infrastructure for economic growth in the economy.
What are the aspects of those linkages that are particularly vulnerable when there's been a conflict situation?
Confidence. For me, as a business person, my first instinct is confidence in the security, confidence in the data, confidence in the systems, confidence in the economy. And so when we talk about post-conflict environments and encouraging, for example, foreign direct investment to come in right from the start, I think that it would be ideal in some instances for that to happen, but I think it does not adequately take into account the private sector's concerns of risk associated with an insecure environment. So I think more realistically, in a post-conflict or conflict or an unstable environment, more realistically looking towards twinning arrangements.
How does that work? Twinning arrangements?
Twinning arrangements. For example, the Post Bank in Romania was twinned with Rabobank during the transition. I worked on that at the time. And it was very effective in building the institutional skills and the sort of the banking, the commercial banking orientation of the Post Bank. But the Post Bank was a new bank, so it was easier to adjust in that environment. But it enabled Rabobank to enter into a riskier market a little more cautiously.
So twinning would be more than internships or sharing staff. There would be some work on the strategic direction, higher level.
Yes.
Contexts
correct.
within the institution.
Correct.
I see.
And management contracts also are very useful in those kinds of environments. And the problem is if you can't get a foreign investor into a country because of security issues, you can't get them into the country to run a bank either. And so the ability to be physically present becomes important. I'd like to add, if I may, I think the importance of ownership it needs to be emphasized more when we talk about how to successfully develop policy reforms and implement them in post-conflict environments, just as is the case in any other environment. I think that it's even more important in a post-conflict environment. And so ensuring that your while we all have our own technical expertise, and there are organizations and there's information available that we've all been trained in with respect to banking soundness and banking supervision and all of that. I think first and foremost we need to ensure that the counterparts believe that these are their banks and their institutions, and they are responsible for ensuring their sustainability and development over time. So being there, that's why I said being there as trusted advisor is more important than being there as someone who is directing the organization. And if I may offer one last bit of advice from my experiences, and that is that post-conflict, a country has, and economic leaders and managers have a lot more to deal with than in other countries, all at the same time. So absorptive capacity is important, but also when we think of our tools that we use as economists in these countries, we need to bear in mind that the task before them and us is far greater when it is one of not just post-conflict stabilization, but also one of adjustment and one of transition from a centrally controlled economy to a market-oriented economy.
Thank you.
Thank you.